Hello, my name is Nathan Madson. I am the managing attorney with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. And today's training is going to provide an overview in some of the major issues for LGBTIQ plus human rights. To begin, we will start with some definitions before moving into a discussion in where LGBTIQ plus issues can be found in human rights law. And then we will discuss some of the major themes in research and reporting. It's important to start with definitions so that we are all on the same page when it comes to the terminology that is being used. But it is important to note that these terms don't always have a fixed meaning, in part because they often are tied to someone's identity. And so, how someone chooses to identify, they may not agree with a specific definition, or they may define certain things differently. So, in general, this is what we can think about these terms, but it is important to recognize that when we're dealing with individuals, whether those are partners, but whether those are clients, um, that we are using definitions that our clients give us, that our partners give us. And if we do need to provide context and definition, to use the definitions that they are providing so that everybody is aware of how these definitions are tied to the individual who's actually providing information to you. These definitions are also context specific, and they are how many, but not all people in the Anglophone global minority, formerly known as the Global North, talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. But it is important to remember, however, that there may be linguistic or regional or cultural or other differences, socioeconomic differences perhaps, about how people talk about these issues. And it's important not to impose these categories onto people. So, for example, if someone were to identify as transsexual or homosexual, these are categories that are now considered to be pejorative or outdated in the global minority, or it's just they're terms that we don't use, such as travesti or tongzhi. We need to provide, and we need to use these terms because they are tied to someone's identity, and we need to explain that terminology, not to dismiss their self-identification and language use. So the first thing that we are going to talk about are these categories here. Sexual orientation refers to an individual's sexual preference. So someone could be homosexual, meaning they're attracted to someone of the same sex. Heterosexual, meaning they're attracted to someone of the opposite sex or a different sex, I should say. Bisexual, meaning they're attracted to two sexes. Pansexual, which means that someone's gender identity doesn't play a role in whether or not someone is they're attracted to someone. But these are all different sexual orientations. There is gender identity, which is how you personally identify with your gender. Um, and so your gender identity can be something that is externally displayed, or it can just be a self-identification. And we don't know what someone's gender identity is based off of the way that they look, based off of the way that they talk, based off of the way they hold themselves or who they spend time with. Gender identity is very much a personal identity. Gender expression is how an individual actually expresses their gender. So that does refer to the clothes that they wear, that refers to the way that they conduct themselves. And so that is more of an external definition than identity. Sex characteristics refer to your biological makeup. So that can refer to things like your chromosomes. It can refer to your external and internal genitalia. It can refer to your gonads. Um, it can refer to your hormones. Romantic attraction is who you are interested in romantically. Oftentimes, romantic attraction and sexual orientation are the same, meaning that You may be sexually attracted to men and romantically attracted to men, but it does not always work that way. There are some times where an individual may have a sexual orientation towards one gender or a sexual orientation towards two different genders, but romantic attraction only with one gender. So they may be willing to engage in sexual activity with people regardless of gender, but they may only be interested in forming a romantic relationship with someone of one gender. And it's also important to note that it is possible to have a sexual orientation and to have no romantic attraction. It's also possible to have romantic attraction, but no, um, but to be asexual. So to be sexually attracted to no one. It's also important to remember that these apply to everyone, not just LGBTIQ plus people. And I'll define LGBTIQ plus in just a moment, but these things apply to everyone. So they apply to cisgender people, they apply to heterosexual people, they apply to endosex people, meaning people who are not intersex. Um, it applies to everyone. So I promised that I would define LGBTIQ plus. That refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, and then other sexual and gender minorities. Um, and we'll discuss some of these other terms in just a moment. But that is sort of the overarching acronym that the advocates uses in their LGBTIQ plus work. But you will also notice that there are many times where we won't use that acronym, or we'll use part of that acronym, but not all of it. And the way that we use acronyms is intentional. And so, if, for example, we're referencing a study that only addresses lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer women, we would not include the G in that acronym. If we are only talking about gay and bisexual men, we would not use the entire acronym. So we want to be accurate in our acronym usage, but generally, if we're not talking about anything super specific, we're just going to be using LGBTIQ plus. Um, but again, also depending on the context, it may not be appropriate to use some of that. So if, for example, there's no usage of the word queer in a particular country, then we would drop the Q. Uh, so moving on to some of these more concrete terms, we have intersex, which is an umbrella term for people who are born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that does not conform to the binary male or female sex characteristics. It can include diversity in hormonal, chromosomal, and or physical sex characteristics. There is queer, which is an umbrella term that encompasses the LGBT plus community, but it also is used to describe individuals who do not wish to describe their gender or their sexual orientation or gender identity with more restrictive LGBT labels. Um, there are also some people, specifically transgender people, who say that queer only refers to sexual orientation and not gender identity. So you may see in your research that some people will write queer and or transgender individuals. So that incorporates both queer people and transgender people. Then the plus is some of the other identities that we are not specifying in this acronym so that the acronym itself does not become unwieldy. So, for example, that may include asexual people. Those are people without sexual attraction, gray sexual or demisexual people who have little or infrequent sexual attraction. Pansexual people who are defined as I said, before their sexual orientation encompasses all genders. Aromantic people, people who have no romantic desire. Agender people, people who do not identify with any particular gender. Non-binary people, which is a relatively broad term to incorporate or to describe people with a gender identity that does not neatly fit into traditional male-female binary. Um, and sometimes this identity is fluid throughout the gender spectrum, so it's not fixed necessarily. And there's many more that are encompassed by this plus. And so we include that plus so that we're not being restrictive in terms of our advocacy on LGBTIQ plus issues. You may come across Two Spirit, which is also abbreviated as 2S, which is an umbrella term for Indigenous or Native American, which is in the US, First Nations, which is in Canada, LGBTIQ plus people. Some Indigenous people will refer to themselves by a specific name within their Indigenous language. Um, but Two Spirit refers to LGBTIQ plus Indigenous North Americans, and it should only be used as a form of identification for Indigenous North Americans, not for non-Indigenous peoples. Um, and you'll often see that 2S added to the LGBTIQ plus acronym. Um, and in Canada, we should note that there is a growing movement to put the 2S at the beginning of the acronym. So 2S LGBTIQ plus, so that we are centering Indigenous or First Nations peoples. Um, Cisgender are people whose gender identity corresponds to the sex that they were assigned at birth. And it's important to note here that cisgender is an important adjective. So if you're saying women, you mean cisgender women and transgender women. If you say women and you only mean cisgender women, it is very important that you include that cisgender part. So you don't want to see something that says women and transgender women. That itself is a false construction because transgender women are women. So you would need to, if you're differentiating between cisgender women and transgender women, include that cisgender adjective. MSM and WSW refer to men who have sex with men and women who have sex with women. This terminology is usually used in public health contexts, um, but it sometimes will appear in other contexts as well. And it refers to any man who has sex with men, regardless of how they identify, or any woman who has sex with women, regardless of how they identify. Um, and it's important to capture this information because even though someone may engage in sexual activity with someone of the same gender, that doesn't mean that they themselves identify as gay or bisexual or queer. And so it's important to not take away their agency to say, you may identify as straight or as heterosexual, but you engage in sex with men, so you're really gay or bisexual or queer. Um, we would then use this kind of terminology. And it's also important to note that sexual activity is not always an indicator of one's sexual orientation either, because again, that is an identity. Um, then Sogi-esque or Sogi-esque, depending on who you're talking to, they may pronounce that with a hard G, refers to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And this is frequently used in the international human rights framework. So, some things to remember when doing this research and this advocacy. Again, not to use LGBTIQ plus unless you're discussing all parts of the LGBTIQ plus community, unless you're making very general statements. We have worked with intersex partners in the past who have said that they find it to be particularly performative to include the I for intersex in advocacy when there is absolutely no information on intersex individuals. So it's important to be accurate when we're using these acronyms. It's also important to explain any differences as to why you are using a different acronym. Um, because when you have a report and you use LGBTIQ plus, you use LGBT, you use LGBTI, all within the same report, it looks inconsistent. And so to include information, oftentimes at the start of the report that says, this is the general acronym that we will be using in any variation on that acronym is intentional and is used to reflect a more nuanced set of people within this LGBTIQ plus community is important. So that builds off of LGBTIQ plus, LGBTQ, LGBTI, etc., are not interchangeable. It's important not to just sub these out because you want to, mix up your writing. These are intentional usages, and we want to make sure that any time that we use a different acronym, that it is intentional. It's important to remember that violations often occur based off of real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. A lot of the times, individuals who experience violence is not necessarily because they are LGBTIQ plus, but because someone is presuming what their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics are. That doesn't mean that we won't include them if they identify as cisgender and straight. It means that we still will because it's based off of a perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. So it's also important to use that language, real or perceived, when doing your reporting as well. You should never assume a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics, not based off of the name that they have, not based off of their physical appearance, not based off of the pronouns that they use. Just don't presume. And that includes information that you are taking from your research. So if someone is being attacked because someone presumes them to be gay, we don't want to make the same presumption. So we say the facts of the situation. They were attacked because they were presumed to be gay. We don't know what their identity is, and we don't want to assume that whoever their attacker was accurate in assessing their sexual orientation. So unless it is clear, unless the individual has made clear what their sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or sex characteristics are, we're not going to presume. Again, everyone has a sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, romantic attraction, and sex characteristics. Everyone does. And this is not just an LGBTIQ plus thing. And also, it's important to remember that knowing one aspect of a person's identity gives you no information about other aspects of their identity. So, if you know, for example, that someone is a transgender woman, that does not mean that you know their sexual orientation. They may be heterosexual, they may be gay, they may be pansexual. You don't know just because you know their gender identity. Same thing with their gender expression. If someone who was assigned male at birth is wearing high heels and a dress, that doesn't mean you know what their gender identity is. It doesn't mean you know what their sexual orientation is, etc. So these are distinct things. Sometimes there is a connection between them, but just because you know one thing doesn't mean you know all of them. So now that we are all on the same page in terms of these definitions, it's important to look at the Human Rights Foundation for LGBTIQ plus rights. So the advocates focus as much of their work in the United Nations. And while regional human rights mechanisms do have their own sets of laws pertaining to LGBTIQ plus rights, we will focus in this training on the United Nations. So at the United Nations, some of the sources of international human rights law include things like treaty law, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, which is non-binding or is a non-binding declaration of human rights principles. But at this stage, it's largely accepted as customary international law. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the OHCHR, which produces opinions and interpretations on human rights law. The Human Rights Council, which is a body of 47 member states of the UN. But it's not just the member states who are actually elected to the council that are participating in council business. And then there's the General Assembly, which is the convening of all UN member states in New York. But this body does not exclusively work with human rights. So these five mechanisms all produce human rights law in different ways, and the two that the advocates most often engage with are treaty law and the Human Rights Council, because they have the most opportunity for non-governmental organizations or NGOs like ours to participate. So, when engaging with treaty law, we often help the treaty monitoring bodies assess whether a country under review is meeting its obligations under the treaty by submitting shadow reports to the treaty monitoring body on the human rights situation on the ground. We also participate in the general comment process by providing treaty monitoring bodies with our input on how treaties should be interpreted. The special procedures are created by the Human Rights Council under specific mandates to either investigate particular themes like sexual orientation and gender identity, torture, or human rights defenders, or to investigate particular countries. The mandate holders often solicit feedback from NGOs and they make country visits and then write reports on particular themes covered by their mandates. The independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity is the mandate holder that is dedicated to working on LGBTQ plus human rights. Notice not intersex rights. But there are many other mandate holders that have incorporated LGBTIQ plus issues into their reports. So, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that a state's refusal to allow transgender people to change their legal gender is a violation of their human rights, and it limits the enjoyment of a wide array of human rights, such as an individual's right to healthcare, employment, and education. Then there is the Universal Periodic Review, which is not created by the Human Rights Council, but it is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council and meets in the council's room. And many of the aspects of the UPR happen within the council. Um, and I will talk more about the UPR in just a moment. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the or I'm sorry, the UPR is a mechanism that is universal, meaning that all of the states that are members of the United Nations will go through it roughly every 5 years. It's a peer-to-peer process, meaning that when a country is under or is in the quote unquote hot seat. They are the country that's under review. Every country can, if they want to, sign up to make recommendations to that country about their human rights records and make recommendations on how they can improve their human rights situation. This can include, or these recommendations then must be responded to. So a country cannot choose to ignore a recommendation. They must say publicly whether they support that recommendation or they reject that recommendation. And then finally, although it is not an official source of human rights law, it is important to draw your attention to the Yogyakarta Principles and the Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10, which are two sets of principles that were written in 2007 and 2017 on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Unfortunately, none of the treaties which form the backbone of the international human rights legal system directly relate to sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, or sex characteristics. But despite this, LGBTIQ plus people are still owed all of the human rights found within these treaties. But the Yogyakarta Principles provide clear guidance on how these human rights, such as the right to privacy or the right to recognition before the law, can and should apply to LGBTIQ plus specific needs, such as the right to privacy, meaning that states should not criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults or force individuals to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity. Or, for example, that the right to recognition before the law means that the state should not consider LGBTIQ plus people as having diminished legal capacity simply because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So now we will look at a few examples of the ways in which international human rights law has been used to protect LGBTIQ plus rights. So first we will look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 10, which says that all persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. So this refers to the rights of people in detention. And while it doesn't specifically name LGBTIQ plus people, it is important to remember that all people in detention, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics, are owed this inherent dignity and to be treated with humanity. Yogyakarta Principle 9, which specifically addresses the rights of people in detention, says that prison officials have a duty to protect all people in detention, including LGBTIQ plus people, from violence perpetrated by other people in detention and prison employees. LGBTIQ plus people should also not be marginalized because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, or exposed to risk of further violence or abuse because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. LGBTIQ plus people should also receive proper medical care, including medical care that is particular to them as LGBTIQ plus people, um, such as gender affirming care. In an attempt to protect LGBTIQ plus people, prison officials must not further restrict the rights of LGBTIQ plus people in detention than what is experienced by the general prison population, which means that they should not be putting LGBTIQ plus people in solitary confinement, for example, under the guise of protecting them. Prison personnel should be trained on equality and non-discrimination, including in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. I mentioned general comments earlier. General comment number 36, to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says that under no circumstances can the death penalty ever be applied as a sanction against conduct, the very criminalization of which violates the covenant, including homosexuality. So, this is a further explanation of the Article 6 right to life under the ICCPR. And it specifically says that countries that retain the death penalty cannot use the death penalty for people um, convicted of quote unquote homosexuality. Although I will point out that just because this says this, that doesn't mean that all countries follow this rule. I mentioned the Universal Periodic Review or the UPR earlier. This is an example of a UPR recommendation. This is a recommendation made to Belgium, to the United States in its third cycle review. And the US accepted this recommendation. The recommendation stating take all possible steps at the state and federal levels to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in credit, education, employment, housing, jury service, public accommodation, and taxpayer funded programs. I mentioned special procedures earlier. This is from paragraph 48 of the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishments 2016 report on the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in international law to the unique experiences of women, girls, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. It says that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons are frequently denied medical treatment and subjected to verbal abuse and public humiliation, psychiatric evaluations, forced procedures such as sterilization, conversion therapy, hormone therapy, and genital normalizing surgeries under the guise of reparative therapies. These procedures are rarely, if ever, medically necessary. They lead to severe and lifelong physical and mental pain and suffering and can amount to torture and ill treatment. This is the page of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the human rights of LGBTI people. You can see that there are considerable reports and specific issues in focus that the OHCHR has provided guidance on in terms of LGBTIQ plus human rights. So that is the foundation of human rights. But now I want to turn to some of the major themes in research and reporting that you may come across in your research and in your advocacy work. I also want to mention that this list is not, of course, exhaustive, but it should be used as a jumping off point in your research and reporting on LGBTIQ plus human rights. Nor are you going to see all of these themes present in every country or that how they will be expressed in how I talk about them today is not necessarily how you're going to see them happening in the particular country that you're researching. So it's important to pay attention to the context of the specific country that you're researching and reporting on. So you may have seen in some countries that it is, quote, illegal to be gay, end quote, or there may be a law against, quote unquote, homosexuality. But the more accurate way of describing this phenomenon is the criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults. And the reason why we say this is in this way is because it's not just gay people or homosexual people that can be caught up under these laws, nor are they laws that criminalize a particular identity. Instead, they're criminalizing practices. They're, in this case, same-sex sexual activity. And anyone can engage in same-sex sexual activity, including heterosexual people, and anyone can be arrested or prosecuted under these laws if a country has criminalized consensual same-sex sexual activity. Within a particular country, however, the laws may say that they criminalize homosexuality or buggery or other related terms. So you may see those specific terms. Typically, in countries where consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults is criminalized, police and other criminal justice system actors do not rely upon or sometimes require evidence that a person has engaged in consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults. Rather, these actors presume that an individual has engaged in consensual same-sex sexual activity with another adult based on how they are dressed, how they act, how they speak, and where and with whom they spend their time. Oftentimes, police are not catching people in the act when they arrest someone under these laws. In some countries that still officially criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults, there are either de jure or de facto, so official or in practice, policies that prevent police from enforcing these laws. Even in those countries, there are reports of police threatening to arrest or prosecute people under these laws in order to harass or extort individuals the police believe to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. Further, laws criminalizing consensual same-sex sexual activity are not the same in every country. In some countries, both men and women can be arrested and prosecuted. In others, only consensual same-sex sexual activity between adult men is criminalized. In countries that do not recognize transgender people's ability to change their legal gender, which is something we'll talk more about later, a transgender woman having sex with a cisgender man or a transgender man having sex with a cisgender woman may trigger these laws as well, because the government recognizes the transgender woman as a man and the transgender man as a woman. In some countries, there may not be laws criminalizing consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults, but there may be unequal ages of consent for individuals engaged in sexual activity with someone of a different sex versus someone of a same sex. For example, the age of consent for different sex sexual activity may be 18, but the age of consent for same-sex sexual activity may be 21. In some instances, we have seen state actors or people who are operating on behalf of or under the protection of the government, such as police, military, members of the government, etc., engage in violence against LGBTIQ plus people. This can include police physically harassing people at pride events, members of the government passing legislation that restricts the rights of or calling for violence against LGBTIQ plus people, members of the military attacking other members of the military if they perceive them to be LGBTIQ plus, etc. In addition, there are often reports that when a member of the LGBTIQ plus community reports a violation of their human rights to police, the police will further victimize the individuals attempting to file a report. That may include the police arresting the individual on suspicion of engaging in consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults or other morality crimes, which we will discuss more later, subjecting the individual to violence and ill treatment, using forced anal examinations to determine whether an individual has engaged in penetrative anal intercourse, etc. Also, it should be noted that these forced anal examinations have absolutely no basis in science, and they can't accurately determine if someone has engaged in penetrative anal intercourse. Um, Finally, it is the state's responsibility to ensure that non-state actors do not violate the rights of others, including LGBTIQ plus people. So if state actors know or have reason to believe that a particular group, such as LGBTIQ plus people, are experiencing violence or other kinds of violations of their human rights by non-state actors, it is their responsibility to take action. It is not just state actors, however, who are engaging in violence against LGBTIQ plus people. Non-state actors or anyone who is not considered a state actor can and do often subject LGBTIQ plus people to violence. In some countries, it is common for mobs or groups of people to attack individuals they know or they believe to be LGBTIQ plus. These may be paramilitary groups, religious groups, criminal gangs, or simply a group of people who choose to target an individual based on their real or assumed sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and or sex characteristics. For example, there have been numerous reports of groups waiting for LGBTIQ plus people outside of clubs or bars or organizations that LGBTIQ plus people are known to frequent. There are also individuals who will join LGBTIQ plus dating sites, connect with an individual, and lure them to a meeting where they will wait to ambush them and inflict physical violence. Some individuals will also dox LGBTIQ plus people or put their personal information online while outing them and call for violence. Finally, families are also sources of violence by non-state actors. Intra-family violence can include things like honor killings, physical abuse, or detaining or using coercive control over family members that they believe to be LGBTIQ+. Both family members and non-family, non-state actors have been known to employ quote unquote corrective rape or forcing someone to engage in non-consensual sexual activity with someone of a different gender in the mistaken belief that this sexual activity will quote unquote cure the suspected LGBTIQ plus person of their quote unquote sexual deviance. Many LGBTIQ plus people who experience a violation of their human rights will not report these violations to police, in part because they fear how police will respond. In many countries, when someone does report a violation to the police will do nothing. They will not record what a victim is telling them. They will not file a police report. They will not investigate. It is as though the victim never entered the police station at all. Sometimes police will act as though they will take action, but their actions are insufficient. They won't thoroughly investigate. Sometimes police will take action, but they will ignore the fact that the violation itself is due to a victim's real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Instead of recognizing that an individual was physically assaulted because the assailant believed the victim to be gay and that the victim's perceived sexual orientation is central to the case, the police will treat the case as though it were a non-bias motivated crime. This kind of treatment fails to capture the realities that real or perceived LGBTIQ plus people experience. And finally, police may ridicule or disparage victims because of their real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. They may say that the victim deserved what happened to them or not take the violation as seriously as if a cisgender heterosexual person reported it. An NHRI, or a National Human Rights Institution, is a body that, while it is created by the state, is independent of the state, that is meant to investigate reports of human rights violations and to promote and protect human rights. The Paris Principles are the internationally agreed upon minimum standards for an NHRI to be considered credible, and those NHRIs that are in full compliance with the Paris Principles are rated an A, and those that are only in partial compliance are rated B by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. I'm not going to go into detail about what the Paris Principles say, but I just wanted to mention that there are certain standards that NHRIs are judged upon. Excuse me. The reason why NHRIs are so important is that they are meant to be independent of the government. So if a government is hostile to LGBTIQ plus people, or they are failing to ensure the human rights of LGBTIQ plus people, an NHRI can hold the government accountable and advise them on how to prevent future violations. An NHRI um, apologies. An NHRI is supposed to be independent and assist a government in meeting its international human rights obligations, including those obligations to LGBTIQ plus people, regardless of social stigma or any de facto or de jure policies against investigating violations against LGBTIQ plus people. Not every country has an NHRI, however, and not every country with an NHRI has an NHRI that is sufficiently independent or that can hold the government accountable. Further, although NHRIs are meant to uphold the human rights of all people without discrimination, the individuals who work at NHRIs are also products of their environments, and they may hold biases against LGBTIQ plus people, or they may not recognize violations on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Legal gender recognition is incredibly important for transgender individuals, as this is the process by which they can change their legal gender, or the gender that appears on their identity documents, and the gender by which the government recognizes them. Unfortunately, there are many countries that do not have legal gender recognition, meaning that transgender people will legally always be regarded as the gender they were assigned at birth, i.e., transgender women will legally be classified as men, and transgender men will legally be classified as women. For a transgender person who has socially transitioned, meaning that they live their lives according to their gender identity, but who has not received legal gender recognition, there may be a discrepancy between their gender expression and outward appearance and their identity documents. This discrepancy will out them as being transgender every time they need to present their identity documents. Even when a country does not have legal gender recognition, there may be other obstacles, such as a long, lengthy, or cumbersome process before an individual can receive legal gender recognition. Some countries require complete genital construction surgery, or sterilization before legal gender recognition, which some transgender people do not want nor or cannot undergo. Some countries allow transgender people to change some of their identity documents, but not all of them. And many countries only allow an individual to go from man to woman or woman to man, meaning that many non-binary people may never have a legal gender that accurately reflects their gender identity. Many people experience discrimination on the basis of their real or their perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. This discrimination can come from both state and non-state actors. Discrimination is not just someone treating another person badly because, for example, they believe that the second person is bisexual. For many LGBTIQ plus people or people thought to be LGBTIQ plus, discrimination can interrupt their other rights, including their rights to education, health, housing, etc. Many LGBTIQ plus people are kicked out of schools, they are isolated within schools, or they are so severely bullied that they are forced to quit school, all of which interrupt their right to education. There's also pervasive discrimination in healthcare, where healthcare professionals will deny or provide subpar medical care when they know or suspect someone is LGBTIQ plus. Discrimination may be both a daily experience for LGBTIQ plus people, or it could be individual or discrete incidents of discrimination. If a state does not have any anti-discrimination laws, or its anti-discrimination laws do not protect against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics, LGBTIQ plus people and those thought to be LGBTIQ plus won't have any recourse when they do experience discrimination. There has been a marked increase in the amount of rhetoric describing LGBTIQ plus people as a threat to children and families. This rhetoric can take many different forms, from LGBTIQ plus people um, not should not be parents because children need one heterosexual cisgender man and one heterosexual cisgender woman in the home, and anything else will confuse them, to accusations that LGBTIQ plus people are the cause of falling marriage and birthright rates. In some states, the government has gone so far as to pass anti-gay, within quotation marks, propaganda laws, which restrict how and where LGBTIQ plus issues can be discussed, often under the guise of protecting children or the public. In many instances, these laws prohibit discussing LGBTIQ plus issues in schools, claiming that doing so will lead to confusion and or children, quote unquote, becoming LGBTIQ plus because it is, quote unquote, fashionable. Some states mandate that any discussion of LGBTIQ plus issues contain condemnations about LGBTIQ plus people, or that being LGBTIQ plus is unnatural or a perversion. Similar rhetoric has been used to prevent comprehensive sexuality education in schools. Anti-gay propaganda laws and similar claims of protecting children and families have been used to restrict or prohibit pride events. There are also claims that being LGBTIQ plus is something that comes from the quote unquote West, and that historically there had never been LGBTIQ plus people in the country before this quote unquote lifestyle was imported. Some rhetoric goes further and alleges that the only way to be a good, upstanding citizen is to enter into a cisgender heterosexual marriage and have children. The anti-gender movement is a growing global movement with transnational connections that says that our focus on gender and gender identity ignores or erases biological sex. The anti-gender movement has played a very serious role in the violations of LGBTIQ plus and women's human rights. The anti-gender movement is not monolithic, however, and some actors are quite selective in what they are opposed to. But in general, the anti-gender movement is opposed to abortion and other aspects of reproductive rights, transgender rights, hate speech and anti-discrimination laws that protect LGBTIQ plus people, sex education, and gender studies. Much of what the anti-gender movement opposes is vaguely labeled as quote unquote gender ideology. The ways in which the anti-gender movement specifically impacts LGBTIQ plus people is through a rejection of gender identity and a focus on biological sex. Many anti-gender actors do not consider transgender people's gender identity to be valid, instead classifying them by their biological sex. Thus, they see transgender women as men and transgender men as women, although many anti-gender actors are more concerned about transgender women, or sorry, yes, transgender women as quote unquote men in dresses, end quote, and the potential harm that they could do to cisgender women than they are about transgender men. Many anti-gender actors argue that gender, quote unquote, erases cisgender women because being a woman is no longer based on biological sex, but rather how one identifies their gender. These actors may also refer to themselves as, quote unquote, gender critical. It's also important to note that the anti-gender movement is increasingly gaining traction within LGB spaces, with many lesbian, gay, and bisexual people refusing to acknowledge transgender people's gender identity and insisting on only acknowledging sex assigned at birth. The anti-gender movement has capitalized on this division by portraying LGB people as quote unquote normal and TIQ plus people as quote unquote abnormal, and a threat to LGBT people's acceptance and hard-won rights. When the anti-gender actors are insisting that biological sex trumps gender, they're often also doing so claiming that there are only two biological sexes, as opposed to the larger diversity of gender identities. But this is a flawed interpretation of biological sex, and it erases intersex people, or which we can define as people who have innate sex characteristics that don't fit medical and social norms for female and male bodies. And this definition comes from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we're going to focus on intersex issues a little bit more later. So, when laws are passed only recognizing two biological sexes, it puts intersex people in a difficult position because their biological sex may not easily be assigned as male or female. Oftentimes, the anti-gender movement argues that LGBTIQ plus rights come at the expense of the anti-gender actors' rights to freedom of religion, and they may argue that it violates their religious beliefs to provide services to LGBTIQ plus people, to recognize someone's gender identity, to speak about LGBTIQ plus people in a specific way, i.e., avoiding hate speech, etc. And finally, it's a common trope among the anti-gender movement that LGBTIQ plus and women's human rights, which are not themselves always distinct categories, because many LGBTIQ plus women are also involved in the women's rights movement, are dangerous to the state, and it upends what is natural or normal. As noted earlier, some countries criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults, and of those, some consider consensual same-sex sexual activity a death-eligible crime, meaning that someone can be sentenced to death and executed for engaging in consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults. Although international human rights law is clear that the death penalty can only be applied to the quote, most serious crimes, end quote, which specifically exclude consensual same-sex sexual activity. You'll remember the slide on the right to life, or the general comment on the right to life that we talked about earlier. There are still 11 countries as of 2025 for which someone convicted of consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults could be sentenced to death. In six of those countries, a death sentence is mandatory. In five, it is a possibility. Fortunately, in not every country in which consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults is a death-eligible crime, is the government actually executing people convicted under these crimes. Even in countries that do not criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults, LGBTIQ plus people or people suspected of being LGBTIQ plus may face criminal charges under vaguely defined morality-based crimes. These crimes are often broad and they can be used by police and the judiciary um, to discriminate against individuals under the guise that their behavior or their dress or their speech or any number of other aspects or actions violate public morality. Finally, regardless of why an LGBTIQ plus person is deprived of their liberty, LGBTIQ plus people in detention oftentimes face violations of their human rights, sometimes under the guise of protection. For example, in an effort to quote unquote protect LGBTIQ plus people in detention, some detention facility administrators will separate LGBTIQ plus people from the cisgender and heterosexual people also housed in the detention center, sometimes in solitary confinement, or they will otherwise restrict their freedoms in ways that exceed that of the non-LGBTIQ plus people in detention. In other detention centers, LGBTIQ plus people experience physical, psychological, and sexual abuse from other people deprived of their liberty and or guards. Transgender people may be housed in detention centers based on their sex assigned at birth, not their gender identity. LGBTIQ plus people may be denied specific healthcare needs, such as gender affirming care or HIV medications, etc. It's important to consider whether these violations of human rights are happening, however, because an individual is LGBTIQ plus or suspected of being LGBTIQ plus, or if it's just that the state simply fails to protect the human rights of all people deprived of their liberty. Well, much of what we have discussed can apply to all LGBTIQ plus people. It is also important to recognize some of the specific human rights violations that intersex people experience. Although we are moving away from this trend, there is a long history of doctors and parents subjecting intersex infants to surgeries meant to quote unquote correct external genitalia, excuse me, to appear more like binary understandings of male and female genitalia. These kinds of surgeries still happen, sometimes without the parent's consent, and sometimes parents lack the ability to consent because they are pressured into subjecting their children to these surgeries when doctors argue that the intersex child needs the surgery or that it would be better for the parents to just choose a sex for the child. Many intersex adults struggle with their lack of bodily integrity and the irreparable changes that were made to their bodies without their consent. It is also not just surgical interventions that intersex people have experienced, but also hormonal and other medical interventions. Another major issue that many intersex people face is a lack of information about their own medical history. Especially for intersex adults, there may have been an active decision by doctors and or their parents to hide important medical information from them under the false belief that if the intersex person knew that they were intersex, they would be confused. There's also, in general, a lack of information about intersex variations. Um, there is not just one way, for example, of being intersex. There's a lack of information about intersex bodies and the experiences of intersex people as well. Data collection often ignores or forgets to collect information on sex characteristics and or intersex people, leading many people, even within the medical community, to not know much about intersex people. Also, as mentioned earlier, many countries adopt binary legal gender or sex classifications, meaning that people can only be a man or a woman or male or female. For some intersex people, though, it's incredibly difficult to classify themselves as either male or female, so a lack of a third option presents challenges. And finally, intersex people face discrimination on the basis of their sex characteristics. And finally, as you are research and writing on LGBTIQ plus human rights, one thing you may encounter is a general lack of information. There may not be information publicly available on LGBTIQ plus issues in a particular state. This lack of information is itself noteworthy and should be called out. How can we monitor and advocate for the protection of LGBTIQ plus people's human rights if we don't know what kinds of violations they are experiencing or even what their lives are like? There are many reasons why there may be a lack of information on LGBTIQ plus human rights. One of the biggest is that it is dangerous being publicly LGBTIQ plus. For example, in countries where consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults is criminalized, it may be incredibly difficult and dangerous for there to be open LGBTIQ plus human rights defenders. People may not share their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics with others because it could put their lives or their safety at risk, even in countries where there are no laws criminalizing consensual same-sex sexual activity between adults. In some states, state and or non-state actors threaten cisgender heterosexual allies who assist LGBTIQ plus people. This can include lawyers representing LGBTIQ plus clients, landlords who knowingly rent to LGBTIQ plus people, teachers who cover LGBTIQ plus issues in class, etc. And finally, given the social and political context in the country, the government and or NGOs may not collect data on LGBTIQ plus people. As I mentioned at the beginning of this training, these are just some of the issues that you may come across when researching and reporting on LGBTIQ plus human rights. And as you begin your research, you may come across other or different issues that you should certainly include in your report. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me. My email is here on the bottom of the slide. And thank you again.